For 47 years, the most dangerous spy in American history coached Little League, attended church every Sunday, helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, and tucked his daughter in at night with bedtime stories. The FBI hunted a ghost across 3 continents and never once looked at the man living quietly on Maple Street. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The morning of June 3, 1962 was unremarkable by every measurable standard. The sun rose over a small Ohio town the way it always did, slow and indifferent, spreading pale light across identical rooftops and identical lawns where identical men in identical suits prepared for identical days. Nobody on Clearwater Drive noticed anything unusual about their newest neighbor. He had moved in 3 weeks earlier with a modest collection of furniture, a friendly wave, and a name so forgettable it barely registered. He introduced himself as Harold Meyers. He said he worked in insurance. He said he had just transferred from Cleveland. He said his wife would be joining him soon once she finished settling some family matters back east. Every single word out of his mouth was a carefully constructed lie, rehearsed hundreds of times in a training facility that did not officially exist, in a country that most Americans could not locate on a map. Harold Meyers was not his real name. Insurance was not his profession. He had no wife waiting in Cleveland. What Harold Meyers did have was a photographic memory, fluency in 4 languages, 18 months of deep cover training, and direct orders from Soviet intelligence to embed himself so completely inside American civilian life that he would become invisible to every intelligence apparatus the United States government possessed. His handlers called this kind of operative a sleeper. The Americans, when they eventually discovered evidence of his existence years later, would call him something far more chilling. They would call him Ghost. To understand how Ghost operated, you have to first understand the America he stepped into. The early 1960s were a time of profound anxiety beneath a surface of manufactured optimism. The Cold War had settled into a permanent hum of dread that every American felt, but rarely spoke about directly. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. Children practiced duck and cover drills at school. The CIA and FBI were stretched thin across 1,000 operations simultaneously, chasing spies in Washington, in New York, in Los Angeles, in every major city where secrets lived and breathed. What they were not adequately watching was the American heartland. The small towns. The suburban neighborhoods where nothing ever happened. This was precisely where Ghost chose to live. He spent his first year doing almost nothing. This is what separated Ghost from every other intelligence asset operating on American soil at the time. He was not in a hurry. His training had conditioned him to understand that patience was not merely a virtue in this profession. Patience was the entire profession. He got a real job at a real insurance company, which served the dual purpose of providing legitimate income and access to financial records of regional businesses, some of which contracted with government facilities. He joined a bowling league. He attended community meetings. He volunteered at the local library on Saturday mornings, helping catalog donations. He was extraordinarily boring, and that boringness was his greatest weapon. By the end of his second year in Ohio, Harold Meyers had become so thoroughly embedded in the community fabric that people actively sought him out. The woman who ran the library, Margaret Holloway, told anyone who would listen that Harold was the most reliable volunteer she had ever had. The coach of the local Little League team asked him to assist with Saturday practices because Harold had mentioned once, in passing, that he had played baseball in college. He had never played baseball in his life. He had spent 3 weeks memorizing statistics and learning the mechanics of the sport specifically so he would have something relatable to discuss with American men. It worked flawlessly. In the spring of 1964, Ghost made his first significant intelligence transmission. It was not dramatic. There were no dead drops in shadowy parking garages. No microfilm hidden inside hollow coins. Ghost had developed a method so elegant it would not be fully understood until decades later when a code specialist finally cracked it. He had been placing classified advertisements in 3 regional newspapers. Advertisements for used furniture, for yard equipment, for miscellaneous household items. Each advertisement contained embedded coded information using a substitution cipher built around American vernacular, so natural and regional that it would never raise suspicion with a domestic analyst. The information he transmitted in that first communication concerned the general movement schedule of a government contractor who worked at a facility 40 miles from Clearwater Drive. It was modest intelligence. Ghost was testing the system. The system worked perfectly. What nobody knew, including Ghost's own handlers back in Moscow, was that he had already begun building something far more valuable than a transmission network. He had begun building a life so authentic, so emotionally real, that it would eventually become something he never anticipated and never trained for. In the fall of 1964, Harold Meyers met a woman named Catherine Webb at a church social. She was a schoolteacher, the daughter of a local hardware store owner, and she had a laugh that Ghost would later describe in his private journals as the most disarming sound he had ever heard in his life. He was not supposed to form genuine attachments. His handlers had been explicit on this point. Emotional investment was a liability. Emotional investment created hesitation. Hesitation got operatives killed. Ghost married Catherine Webb in June of 1965. His handlers were furious. He assured them the marriage was a strategic asset, that a married man in a small American town was exponentially less suspicious than a bachelor, that Catherine's deep community roots gave him layers of social cover that money could not buy. Everything he told them was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was something Ghost himself struggled to confront directly. He had fallen in love with her. Genuinely, completely, and without calculation. The years that followed were the most operationally productive of Ghost's career and simultaneously the most psychologically complex. Catherine gave birth to their daughter, Rachel, in 1967. Ghost held his daughter in the delivery room and felt something shift inside him that no amount of ideological training could have predicted or prevented. He did not stop his work. He could not stop his work. The machinery of his mission was too deeply embedded in his daily life to simply switch off. But something had changed in the quality of his attention. He began to be more careful. Not for the mission. For them. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Ghost expanded his intelligence network carefully and methodically. He had by this point cultivated relationships with 4 individuals who, without ever knowing they were doing so, provided him with fragments of information that, assembled together, painted detailed pictures of regional defense infrastructure. None of these individuals were recruited spies. They were ordinary people. A man who worked at a munitions supplier and complained about his job at bowling league. A woman who was a secretary at a government contractor and shared too many details about her frustrations at work during library volunteer shifts. A retired military officer who had moved into the neighborhood and enjoyed long conversations about strategy and history over backyard barbecues. Ghost never asked direct questions. He never pressed for information. He simply listened with extraordinary attention and remembered everything with the precision of a recording device. By 1971, the FBI had received 3 separate intelligence tips suggesting the existence of a highly sophisticated Soviet sleeper agent operating somewhere in the American Midwest. The tips were fragmentary and contradictory. One suggested the agent was female. One suggested the agent was operating out of a major metropolitan area. One suggested the agent had already been extracted and the operation was dormant. None of the tips pointed anywhere near a small Ohio town. None of them contained the name Harold Meyers. The FBI assigned a mid-level analyst named Frank Calloway to compile the tips into a preliminary report. Calloway spent 4 months on the project, produced a 30-page document, and concluded that the most likely scenario was that the intelligence was a deliberate disinformation campaign designed to waste American analytical resources. His supervisor agreed. The file was archived. Ghost, who had no knowledge of this investigation, continued his work undisturbed. The 1970s brought new complexity. The political landscape of America was shifting in ways that both fascinated and troubled Ghost. He watched Watergate unfold with the detached analytical interest of a man reading a case study. He watched the Vietnam War end and registered the collective national exhaustion of a country that had spent a decade bleeding for something it could no longer fully articulate. He watched and he transmitted, and he lived his life on Clearwater Drive with a fidelity to routine that was almost meditative. Every Tuesday evening he had dinner with Catherine's parents. Every Thursday he attended a community council meeting. Every Saturday morning he was at the library. Every Sunday he sat in the third pew from the front at First Methodist Church and sang hymns in a warm baritone that several congregation members had privately told Catherine was one of the finest voices in the building. Rachel grew up watching her father be the most steady, reliable, present man she had ever known. He helped her with homework every evening without complaint or impatience. He attended every school play, every recital, every parent-teacher conference. When she was 10 years old and terrified before a piano recital, he held her face in his hands and told her that the most important thing in the world was not whether she played perfectly, but whether she played honestly. She never forgot those words. She would not understand them fully for another 30 years. In 1979, Ghost received a communication that deeply unsettled him. His handlers wanted him to begin cultivating a specific target. A man who had recently moved to a neighboring county and who held a mid-level position at a defense contractor with classified government projects. Ghost was given detailed instructions on how to engineer a friendship with this man. The instructions were thorough, professional, and absolutely standard procedure for his line of work. Ghost followed them. He engineered the friendship over the course of 8 months, attending the same gym, joining the same civic organization, creating enough natural overlap that the friendship grew organically in the way all good manufactured relationships do. The man's name was Robert Tanner. He had a wife named Linda and twin boys who played soccer. He was funny and generous and talked too much when he had a second beer. Ghost transmitted information derived from his relationship with Robert Tanner for 3 years. Then in 1982, Robert Tanner was diagnosed with cancer. Ghost sat with him during chemotherapy. He drove him to appointments when Linda needed to be with the boys. He sat in hospital waiting rooms reading magazines and drinking bad coffee and doing something that had no operational value whatsoever. He was being a friend. A real one. When Robert Tanner died in the spring of 1983, Ghost was a pallbearer at the funeral. He wept at the graveside. The tears were not performed. This disturbed him more than anything that had happened in 20 years of operational work. The 1980s brought intensified American counterintelligence activity. The Reagan administration had made identifying and neutralizing Soviet intelligence assets a national priority. The FBI and CIA were better funded, better coordinated, and more aggressive than they had been at any point in the previous 2 decades. Several Soviet assets were identified and either arrested or quietly expelled during this period. Ghost received urgent communications from his handlers instructing him to reduce operational activity, limit transmissions, and under no circumstances take any action that could attract attention. Ghost did something at this point that his handlers did not authorize and would not have approved. He stopped transmitting entirely for 14 months. Not because he was afraid. Because Catherine had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and for the first time in his professional life, Ghost made a decision based entirely on personal rather than operational priorities. He devoted himself completely to her care. He cooked every meal. He researched every treatment option with the same meticulous thoroughness he brought to intelligence analysis. He sat beside her hospital bed and read to her from novels she loved. He held her hand through procedures that made him physically ill to witness. Catherine recovered. It took 18 months. During that entire period, the Soviet intelligence apparatus received nothing from one of its most productive long-term assets, and Ghost did not care even slightly. When he resumed operational activity in 1987, something fundamental had changed in the nature of his work. He was going through the motions with the professional competence of a man who had mastered his craft so thoroughly that he could perform it without full engagement. But the fire that had driven him in the early decades was banked low. He had lived inside this American life for so long that the ideological framework that had originally justified everything he was doing had become abstract to the point of meaninglessness. He did not believe in the mission the way he once had. He believed in Catherine. He believed in Rachel, who was now 20 years old and studying literature at a state university and calling home every Sunday evening without fail. He believed in the house on Clearwater Drive with its slightly overgrown backyard and its kitchen that smelled of coffee and the particular quality of afternoon light through the living room windows in October. The Cold War ended in 1991. Ghost received a final formal communication from his handlers. The communication was brief, professionally worded, and essentially amounted to a release. The operation was concluded. His service was acknowledged. He was free to continue his civilian life without further obligation. There were no instructions for extraction, no plans for his return. He had been so thoroughly converted into an American civilian that the apparatus that created him had no practical use for him in the new geopolitical landscape. He was simply left there on Clearwater Drive, inside the life he had built, which was now the only life he actually had. He told Catherine nothing. He had made this decision long ago and revisited it constantly over the years and always arrived at the same conclusion. The truth would not liberate her. The truth would destroy everything she believed about her own life, her marriage, her history. The truth would take from her the only version of Harold Meyers she had ever known, and that man, whatever his origins, had loved her without reservation for nearly 30 years. Ghost made his peace with the silence. He buried it in the same place he buried everything else that could not exist in the light of his daily life, and he went on. Rachel graduated, built a career, married a good man named David, and gave Ghost and Catherine 2 grandchildren whom Ghost adored with a completeness that regularly surprised him. He had not expected to be a grandfather. He had not expected any of this. The grandfather who pushed strollers through the park on weekend mornings and read picture books in funny voices and fell asleep in the armchair with a grandchild on his chest was a man so far removed from the operative who had stepped off a Greyhound bus in Ohio in 1962 that they seemed like entirely different people. Perhaps they were. Catherine died in 2003. Ghost sat beside her bed in the same hospital where Rachel had been born, in the same way he had sat beside Robert Tanner 20 years earlier, and he held her hand until it was no longer warm. He did not perform his grief. It was the most honest emotion of his entire American life. He buried her in the church cemetery 3 blocks from First Methodist, in the 3rd row from the left where the old oak tree cast afternoon shade across the stones, and he visited her grave every Sunday after church until his own legs made the walk difficult. He lived another 8 years after Catherine. They were quiet years. Rachel and David lived 40 minutes away and visited frequently. The grandchildren grew into teenagers who still called him Grandpa Harold and still accepted his hugs without the self-consciousness that teenagers usually deployed against grandparents. He was fortunate in this. He knew it. He had a small garden in the back where he grew tomatoes and peppers every summer with the same methodical patience he had applied to everything in his life. He read voraciously. He maintained the house on Clearwater Drive with the quiet pride of a man who understood that the physical space you inhabit is a kind of autobiography. He did not write anything down. He had never written anything down. Except once. In the winter of 2009, Harold Meyers sat at the same kitchen table where he had drunk coffee and encoded intelligence transmissions for nearly 5 decades, and he wrote a letter. It took him 11 days to write. He addressed it to no one. He left it unsigned. It was 34 pages handwritten in his precise, careful script, and it was the most complete and honest account of his life that had ever existed in any form anywhere on Earth. He placed the letter inside a metal box along with his codebooks, 3 rolls of microfilm, 6 passports bearing 6 different names and 6 different photographs, all unmistakably his face, and a shortwave radio that had not been operational since the late 1980s. He placed the metal box inside a false compartment he had built beneath the basement floor in 1968, a compartment so carefully constructed that it was functionally invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and how to open it. Then he went upstairs and made himself dinner and watched the evening news and called Rachel to say goodnight. Harold Meyers died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March of 2011. The official cause was cardiac arrest. He was 73 years old. He died in the same bed where he had slept for 49 years, in the same house where he had lived the most elaborate and improbable double life in the history of American counterintelligence, and he died without ever having been suspected, investigated, questioned, or identified by any law enforcement or intelligence agency on either side of the Cold War divide. The first twist came 3 months after his death. Rachel and David had begun the process of clearing out the family home on Clearwater Drive. It was the particular grief of adult children sorting through a parent's belongings, the archaeology of a life expressed in objects and papers, and the accumulated material evidence of decades of living. Rachel had been in the basement for 2 hours working through old boxes when she noticed something about the floor she had never noticed in 40 years of living in that house. One section of the concrete near the back wall had a slightly different texture, a slightly different color. She told herself it was nothing. She moved a storage shelf to reach a box behind it, and the shelf leg caught on something, and when she looked down she saw the edge of a seam she had not seen before. What she found in that compartment did not initially make sense to her. Her mind refused to assemble the pieces into their correct shape. She sat on the cold basement floor for a long time looking at the codebooks and the passports and the microfilm and the radio and trying to locate a rational explanation that did not mean what it obviously meant. Then she picked up the letter. She read all 34 pages sitting on that basement floor. She read them twice. By the time she finished the second reading, the light through the small basement window had shifted from afternoon to early evening, and she was completely, utterly still. The second twist was in the letter itself. Ghost had written about everything. His recruitment, his training, his mission, his transmissions, his network, the people he had cultivated and used without their knowledge. Robert Tanner, the woman from the library. Every detail of every operation spanning nearly 3 decades. But the final pages of the letter were not about the mission. They were about Catherine. They were about Rachel. They were about the grandchildren by name with specific memories attached to each name. They were written in a voice so tender and undefended that Rachel, who had spent 3 hours reading about the systematic deception of her entire existence, found herself weeping not from betrayal, but from the absolute unmistakable evidence of a man who had loved his family with everything he actually was, not just everything he pretended to be. The man who had deceived a nation for 5 decades had apparently been incapable of deceiving himself about the one thing that mattered to him most. Rachel did not call the FBI that evening. She did not call them the next day either. She sat with what she knew for 3 weeks, talking to no one, carrying the weight of it through her ordinary days with the same composed exterior her father had maintained for half a century. Then she made a decision that surprised even herself. She called a historian at a nearby university who specialized in Cold War intelligence history. Not law enforcement. Not the government. A historian. Because what she had in that basement was not a crime to be prosecuted. The man who committed the acts described in that letter was dead and beyond the reach of any court. What she had was history. Undeniable, documented, intimate history that no intelligence agency had ever possessed, and that changed the official record of the Cold War in specific and significant ways. The historian's name was Dr. Patricia Cole. When Rachel placed the metal box on Patricia's office desk and told her what was inside, Patricia sat quietly for a moment and then asked Rachel one question. She asked whether Harold had ever expressed, in the letter or anywhere else, any remorse for what he had done. Rachel thought about this carefully before answering. She said that her father had not expressed remorse in any conventional sense. What he had expressed, in those final pages, was something more complicated. He had expressed the genuine bewilderment of a man who had lived so long inside a constructed life that he could no longer locate the boundary between the construction and the truth. He had written that he could not honestly say which version of himself was real. The spy or the father. The operative or the neighbor. The man who transmitted secrets or the man who wept at his wife's grave every Sunday morning in a small Ohio town where everyone knew his name and nobody knew anything about him at all. Dr. Patricia Cole spent 4 years analyzing and contextualizing the contents of that metal box. The codebooks alone rewrote the academic understanding of Soviet cipher methodology in the American Midwest during the Cold War period. The microfilm contained documentation that clarified the origins of 3 intelligence breaches that had never been fully explained. The passports told the story of a man who had crossed international borders 17 times during his years on Clearwater Drive without anyone who loved him knowing he had ever left the state. When Patricia's findings were finally published, they created a significant stir in intelligence and academic circles. Former CIA and FBI officials were interviewed. Several expressed professional admiration for the operational sophistication of Ghost's methodology, even as they acknowledged the profound damage his work had caused. One retired FBI counterintelligence director, speaking on background, said something that became the most quoted line in every subsequent article written about the case. He said that Ghost had not beaten them through superior technology or resources or information. Ghost had beaten them by understanding something about America that Americans themselves sometimes forgot. He said Ghost had understood that in a country built on the idea that anyone can become anything, the most dangerous person in the room is always the one who becomes exactly what you expect to see. Rachel still lives 40 minutes from Clearwater Drive. The house was sold after Patricia's research was complete, purchased by a young family who painted the front door red and planted new flowers along the walk and knew nothing about what had happened inside those walls for nearly 50 years. The false compartment in the basement was sealed with concrete before the sale. Rachel kept the letter. She keeps it in a box in her closet, and she has not read it again since those 2 readings on the cold basement floor, but she has also never considered destroying it. It is the most complete version of her father that exists anywhere. The spy whose identity remained unknown for decades was also, by every measure that Rachel can honestly apply to the question, the best father she ever could have had. Some men carry secrets to their graves. Harold Meyers carried his all the way through, intact and undetected, and left them for his daughter to find in the quiet aftermath of an ordinary grief, in the basement of a house on a street where nothing ever happened, on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was just beginning to change. If you love your mom and dad the way Rachel loved her father, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. Every single subscriber on this channel is a reminder that the stories worth telling are always the ones closest to home. Now we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, where in the country are you watching from right now? Are you watching from New York, Texas, California, Florida, the Midwest, the South, a small town, a big city? Let us know where you are. We read every single comment, and this community means everything to us.